safer world is possible, and together we can and will make it happen. Thank you.
When you show up in community, you find that group that makes you feel like home, but oftentimes you also find yourself again.
Because Meghan and I love Susan Hussey. We think she's great. And I also know that what she meant, she never meant any harm at all. But the response from the British press and from people online because of the stories that they wrote was horrendous. It was absolutely horrendous, the response.
And that fascinated me for a number of reasons, not least because I need a little bit of help understanding properly the difference between racism and unconscious bias. He has a crack at explaining it shortly. And secondly, because that was not in the script, was it? When we were reading about Susan Hussey and her comments to Ngozi Fulani, and everybody was taking a side, I think myself included, although I'm pretty sure at the time we talked about the difference between not knowing any better and deliberately setting out to be offensive, which is perhaps part of the distinction between racism and unconscious bias. But that there, we love her, he said. I mean, words at least as warm as any that came out of Kensington Palace or Buckingham Palace in defence of this woman. Interesting, really, to reflect upon how the issue of racism in the royal family has been kicked front and centre by Meghan and her husband. And yet on this particular flashpoint, no one ever thought to ask them what they thought. And now we know. Sympathetic towards Lady Susan Hussey, much more sympathetic towards Lady Susan Hussey than perhaps a lot of the commentary at the time allowed, although most of the newspapers were close to defending her. The idea that there is more nuance to these sort of issues than many of us allow in our binary footballified analyses really stopped me in my tracks. It really stopped me in my tracks. Because I sort of thought, well, what's the difference between unconscious bias and racism? And then I thought, well, I suppose the difference is that intent, isn't it? If you say something that upsets somebody else on grounds of their ethnicity, and then it is explained to you why that was upsetting, you have a choice, don't you? You either say, oh God, that's so woke, or oh, it's political correctness gone mad, or whatever the modern version of that sort of bigotry defence might be, or you go, oh gosh, yeah, sorry, I won't do that again. I'm sorry. And that fascinated me because, oddly, given that the battle lines have been drawn up and that we're all supposed to be Team Harry or Team Charles or Team William or Team Camilla or whatever it might be, oddly, that was evidence of rapprochement or nuance or an attempt to come to a slightly better understanding of things. I thought that was incredible. I really did. That simple notion of him being the one to say, actually, this isn't a binary issue. We didn't accuse them of racism. The newspapers said that we'd accused them of racism. We shared a story that we believe displays unconscious bias. In its simplest terms, it's not a question you'd ask a white person, I mean, for the most obvious of reasons. And therefore, when you ask it as a white person, perhaps you're not being suitably conscious of how that particular question reaches the ears of a person of colour. And that's a bias. We are all biased in various ways. But when it's unconscious, you deserve, I think he is suggesting, more sympathy than when it's conscious. In fact, when it's conscious, I'm not sure you deserve any sympathy. So can we do that first today? Do you want to have a crack at explaining what the difference is between racism and unconscious bias? And then we will look at why. The questions about the darkness of the skin of their baby and Susan Hussey's questions about where Ngozi Fulani really came from are evidence of one, but not the other. But that's your entry point. What is the difference between racism and unconscious bias? Because surely, at least in one sense, they're the same thing. You're just being unconsciously racist as opposed to deliberately racist. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. And if you want, it's depending entirely upon you. We may talk about what you made of the interview in general, but I find myself once again married to the idea that what you have to say is only really going to be interesting if your opinion is slightly different or profoundly different by the end of what you saw last night than it was at the beginning. If it's just enforced your affections or unpleasantnesses, your dislikes or your likes, I don't know how helpful it would have been. I'll tell you now, he was much cleverer than I realised, much more articulate than I thought he was. I was on Fleet Street when he was a kid, and we were always hearing about how poor he was at school and how dreadful his exam results were, and he made comments himself as well, didn't he, about not having read much Shakespeare. But in terms of articulacy and clarity, his use of language, I was actually impressed, if that doesn't sound condescending or patronising. I thought, crikey, I can see why he's confident doing these interviews. He's well more than up to the job. 10:17 is the time. Here you go. Here's an interesting question to start with from Emma in Wimbledon. Hello, James. If it wasn't such a serious issue as racism, why did Harry and Meghan bring up the comment of their son's skin in the Oprah interview? Well, I'll tell you, Emma, because unconscious bias is a really, really serious issue. In many ways, it's a more serious issue than racism, because overt racism is both easy to identify and easy to understand. But unconscious bias, where we are unwittingly, unintentionally offensive, is hugely important. I'm happy to explain that. I hope your question's not disingenuous, but that's why. And all the effort that the Daily Mail and others put into poo-pooing the idea of unconscious bias training looks even more ridiculous and sinister now than it did before. Who is most in need of unconscious bias training? People who suffer from it. Would Lady Susan Hussey have said what she said to Ngozi Fulani if she'd received it? No, she clearly wouldn't. Would that member of the family have been asking them in quite that way about the potential darkness of their baby's skin if they'd had unconscious bias training? I don't think so.
Welcome back, Squadies. Today on Sussexful, Emma is diving deep into one of the most emotional reactions we've seen in a long time. James O'Brien's powerful reflection on Harry and Meghan showing sympathy toward Lady Hussey after the Ngozi Fulani incident. James didn't just talk about the situation. He spoke directly to the idea of healing, of reaching back to that wounded 10-year-old inside all of us, and it moved people to tears. One commenter shared something incredibly personal. Her husband was racially abused every single day as a child growing up in Portsmouth in the 80s, and because of that trauma, he sees Harry as a disgrace and struggles to understand Harry's own journey. And the question she asked, how can I help him find that understanding, is so important. The truth is, you don't start with defending Harry. You start by acknowledging his pain. You start by saying, what you went through was real, awful, and undeserved, and I see how those experiences shaped the way you view the world today. From that place of compassion, you can gently explain why James O'Brien's words resonated, why hearing someone speak with empathy toward their younger self can crack open emotions we didn't even know we were carrying. Healing doesn't look the same for everyone. Harry's healing won't resemble the healing of someone who endured racism on the streets every day, but the idea of confronting your past instead of burying it is universal. And when we understand that, we can see that showing compassion, even toward people we disagree with, isn't weakness. It's growth. Let me know in the comments, Squadies. Did James's message hit you too? And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means everything. Royal sympathy and the Ngozi Fulani incident. A nuanced response. Look, I'm not here to sugarcoat this whole mess, but Harry and Meghan's response to the Ngozi Fulani incident was actually kind of fascinating. They didn't go nuclear, they didn't grandstand, they just demonstrated genuine human sympathy, which, honestly, feels like a radical act these days. Healing wounds. The therapeutic power of inner child connection. James O'Brien's profound therapeutic insights struck a deep emotional chord, revealing the transformative potential of reconnecting with one's wounded inner child. By encouraging listeners to empathetically engage with their younger selves, O'Brien illuminated how unresolved childhood experiences can profoundly shape adult perspectives and relationships. His compassionate approach suggests that understanding and healing childhood trauma isn't just personal therapy, but a pathway to broader emotional intelligence and interpersonal understanding. The raw vulnerability in listeners' responses, like the poignant account of a husband who experienced racial abuse as a child, demonstrates how O'Brien's words resonate beyond mere commentary, touching the tender, unhealed spaces within people's psychological landscapes and offering a gentle, transformative lens for self-reflection and healing. Royal trauma: unraveling generational perspectives on race and healing. In the complex landscape of racial trauma, Harry's experiences really shine a light on the deep emotional scars left by childhood racial abuse, showing us just how much generational perspectives can differ, even within the same family or community. While Harry has openly confronted the psychological impact of racial discrimination and sought healing through vulnerability, his approach stands in stark contrast to those like the listener's husband, who, after experiencing daily racial abuse in 1980s Portsmouth, still holds on to a more traditional stoic stance, seeing Harry's public processing as, well, a weakness rather than a strength. This generational divide, y'all, reflects not just the ways individuals cope, but also broader societal shifts in how we understand racial trauma. Younger generations are really starting to value emotional acknowledgement and therapeutic healing, moving away from that old expectation of silent endurance and just suppressing painful experiences. Healing wounds: a path to understanding and empathy. In the delicate landscape of familial and generational conflict, finding common ground, well, it really takes a deep willingness to look past our own hurt and truly try to understand where the other person is coming from. For Harry, this means recognizing that his husband's experiences of racial abuse aren't just old stories. They're deeply traumatic lived experiences that shape how he sees the world and how he responds emotionally. By approaching these conversations with real empathy, listening without getting defensive and acknowledging the pain of previous generations, there's a real chance to bridge divides that might seem impossible to cross. The key, honestly, is creating a safe emotional space where both folks can vulnerably share their experiences, understanding that healing isn't about winning an argument, but about appreciating the nuanced human stories that have shaped each person's sense of identity, belonging, and resilience. The deep roots of emotional healing really start with confronting childhood trauma. You know, childhood experiences aren't just fleeting memories. They're powerful architects of our adult psychological landscape, silently shaping how we see things, how we react, and how we feel, long after those moments have passed. Traumatic experiences, especially the ones rooted in systemic racism, discrimination, or just plain personal vulnerability, can create deep psychological wounds that echo through generations. These wounds influence how folks understand themselves and how they interact with the world around them. The critical importance of addressing these early experiences isn't just about personal healing. It's about breaking those generational cycles of pain, understanding the complicated ways childhood wounds show up in adult behavior, and, honestly, developing empathy for ourselves and for others who've walked these same emotional paths. By making space for open, compassionate conversations about childhood trauma, we open the door for collective understanding, individual transformation, and the chance to rewrite those old narrative patterns that have been holding back emotional growth and our connections with others. Healing generational wounds really comes down to the power of empathetic reflection. Understanding those deeply ingrained family perspectives means taking a compassionate journey into our personal histories, especially when we're faced with emotional landscapes shaped by racial experiences. For example, gently encouraging a loved one, like a husband, to reconnect with his younger self. The vulnerable child who endured daily racial abuse in Portsmouth back in the 1980s can create a bridge of understanding that crosses over generational divides. The aim isn't to challenge his current views about Prince Harry or anything like that, but to invite introspection, letting his inner child speak, feel heard, and maybe even reframe that narrative of pain and resilience. This delicate approach of empathetic listening has the power to transform generational trauma into a moment of shared human connection. It helps us see that beneath all the political opinions and public personas, there are individual human experiences of hurt, survival, and hopefully, healing. Breaking the silence, celebrity voices against systemic racism has become more important than ever. High-profile figures like Harry and Meghan have this extraordinary platform that really goes beyond traditional celebrity influence. They're positioned as critical agents of social change when it comes to confronting systemic racism. Their willingness to publicly address uncomfortable racial dynamics, especially within places like the British royal family, is more than just sharing a personal story. It's a strategic move that amplifies marginalized voices and sparks those bigger societal conversations. By using their global visibility, they turn personal experiences into universal dialogues about racial prejudice. It's a clear demonstration of how influential public figures can challenge deeply rooted discriminatory norms and, honestly, create meaningful pathways for understanding and transformation. Healing through understanding is, in my view, the real path to reconciliation. As we navigate the tricky landscape of human interactions, true compassion shows up when we commit to creating spaces for genuine dialogue and empathetic listening. Moving forward, it takes a careful but intentional approach, one that centers on understanding the deep-rooted emotional experiences of others, especially those who've faced systemic challenges or personal trauma. By fostering an environment of open, honest communication, we can start to bridge divides that might seem impossible to cross, recognizing that every person carries a unique story shaped by what they've lived through. The key isn't judgment or defensiveness, but cultivating a mutual respect that lets folks share their stories without fear of being dismissed or hurt again. Ultimately, that's what creates the pathways toward mutual understanding and collective healing.